delighted to have finally mastered the connection, and I'm happy to be here today. And I'm particularly happy that you're all giving me an opportunity to talk about a topic that I've worked on for a very, very long time. What I'd like to do is to talk a little bit about, I think my screen sharing is disabled. It's working now, perfect. What I'd like to do is to talk a little bit about basic income in the context of the pandemic. Before COVID-19 came along, we were already very well aware in Canada that inequality was becoming a growing problem in this country. We were already very well aware that many of the social programs that we had in place weren't very functional, weren't working very well to address poverty. When the pandemic came along, the conversation became much more dramatic, and it's changed rather drastically in the context of public health shutdowns. Right now, we're mired in the exigencies of COVID-19. We're waiting for the vaccine to be available. We're waiting to go back to something resembling a normal life. But none of us really knows what the economy is going to look like when it returns to, it won't return to the same format that it was in before the pandemic came along. There will be changes. And in a very few months, we'll be wondering about how to transition people who lost their jobs in the pandemic back to work, how to transition them to other social programs. In that context, a lot of provinces have begun to talk about basic income. Some of the Atlantic provinces have petitioned the federal government to step forward and to develop a basic income program. In British Columbia, a panel on basic income has just released a report suggesting that the province of British Columbia can go halfway towards introducing a basic income on its own. They recommended a targeted basic income for people with disabilities, for women leaving violent relationships, for children aging out of the foster care system. But they stopped short of recommending a basic income for all residents with low incomes. And before I talk about what we mean by basic income and why Canada could benefit from a basic income, I just want to leave you with one of the findings from that report. As part of their investigation, they examined all of the social programs that are available in British Columbia. And they came up with 177 different programs that try to support people with low incomes in British Columbia. Some of them are delivered by the federal government, some of them are delivered by the provincial government, some by municipalities. They are uncoordinated programs, all run by their own bureaucracies, all with different points of entry, different application processes, different eligibility requirements, and different regulations. And as you keep that in mind, I think we have to ask whether that's the most efficient way to be addressing the problem of poverty and the problem of inequality in our society. So when COVID-19 came along, what it did was to accelerate some of the changes that were already occurring in society. And it made us aware of many inequalities that we might have set aside and not paid a great deal of attention to. Half of all Canadian households were in no position to pay for their basic expenses if they lost their job due to COVID-19. They couldn't pay the rent and put food on the table. A third of the workforce was employed in precarious jobs. And by that, I mean low-paying jobs with no security. In many cases, they were working part-time when they prefer to be working full-time. And they, of course, were the most vulnerable to changes in hours worked and changes in possibilities. Another thing that happened is that many Canadians who thought they had secure jobs and never expected to need support from the government discovered that their jobs weren't quite as secure as they thought they were. And so they turned to social programs, and some of them had a rather brutal awakening. The first place that most people would look in Canada if they lost their job was to employment insurance. And employment insurance depends on the number of hours you've worked in the previous year. It turns out that many displaced workers, particularly displaced workers working at minimum wage jobs, didn't have enough hours to qualify. If they did have enough hours to qualify, the amount of money they'd receive from employment insurance depended on previous earnings. So in many cases, it was too low to meet their basic needs. And employment insurance pays support for a temporary period of time. And the length of time for which you can receive support depends on where in the country you live and the strength of the labor market. So if you live in a part of the country where the unemployment rate is fairly low, the length of support from employment insurance might be as short as 14 weeks. The other major program that Canadians can look to if they lose their job is provincial income assistance or social assistance or welfare, depending on which province you live in. The names are different, but they all share certain characteristics. In all cases, the level of support is inadequate. It would pay a single adult about $9,000 a year in most provinces of Canada or less. It's highly conditional, it's highly bureaucratic. People who were already surviving on provincial income assistance or disability support were further disadvantaged. These programs are so inadequate that most people rely on food banks and rely on other organizations to fill the gaps. And the food banks, of course, struggled to keep up because they lost their volunteer labor, they lost donations. In many cases, school lunch programs ended when the schools closed. So the people who were already the most marginalized in society were dramatically affected by COVID-19. But all of the findings weren't necessarily negative. One thing we learned is that we do have the capacity to do a much better job than we have in the past. In particular, the Canadian Emergency Response Benefit, the CERB, was developed in a matter of weeks by the federal government. It was up and running very quickly. There was a simple application process. It was a matter of going online, reporting your income, and the money arrived in people's bank accounts in a matter of days. And that's really a revolutionary way of delivering social programs. It's much less bureaucratic than other programs we've had. It doesn't require people to have completed tax forms in the past. And so that showed us that we have the capacity to deliver a modern, responsive social support program for the 21st century. Now, that's not to say it was perfect. Obviously, there were difficulties with it. But all of the difficulties associated with the rollout related to the condition, the requirement that in order to qualify, you had to have earned $5,000 in the previous 12 months. And the government did not define income very carefully. And that meant that a lot of people who received support subsequently received letters from the Canada Revenue Agency, from the income tax people, demanding repayment. Now, a basic income, by definition, doesn't depend on prior earnings. You don't have to have worked in order to qualify for support. So this delivery mechanism becomes something we can think about when we think about how to deliver a basic income, how to get money into people's hands. So when we talk about a basic income in Canada, we think about basic income as being one component of the social safety net. So it doesn't replace important social services, public services, like, for example, housing and healthcare, education. These services are still necessary, still part of what we require to live an adequate life in a high-income country like Canada. But what it does replace is the set of cash transfers from various levels of government. It does replace provincial income assistance. It does replace small tax credits like the GST credit from the federal government and their counterparts in the provinces. It does replace a lot of those 177 programs that the panel on basic income in British Columbia discovered. And British Columbia is like every other province. So it's a way of streamlining the social assistance landscape and using more of the money to get into the hands of the people who need it, rather than into the hands of the bureaucrats who run the system. So basic income is paid in the form of money. The rationale is that if people receive money, they can use that money to meet their own needs. They can identify their own needs and they can spend the money in ways that they find most important. They don't have to rely on programs to identify their needs for them. A basic income sets a floor. It's a guaranteed income below which no resident of Canada should be expected to live. It doesn't depend on work status, so you don't have to have worked in the past in order to qualify for support. And it's also available to people who are currently working, as long as they meet other requirements. So basic income sets a floor. Someone with no other income would receive the, sorry, I seem to have lost my, sorry, I seem to have lost my capacity to share.
Sorry, your screen share is working.
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay, you can, I can't.
Oh,
Sorry.
okay.
I can't get the, okay, all right.
You can see it now?
I see something.
Do a control tab.
Right.
I can.
Hello, do a control tab and that will bring the other screen forward.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, all right, I apologize. In any case, in the Canadian conversation, basic income usually takes the form of a guaranteed income. So it's universally accessible, but not everybody receives money every month. There is a guaranteed level, a guaranteed income that people with no other income would receive. If you have income from other sources, your benefit would be reduced by some portion of your other earnings. So basic income replaces income assistance, provincial income assistance for people with no other source of income, but it also tops up the wages of low-income working people. So if, for example, you're working a minimum wage job and you still don't earn enough money to raise yourself and your family above the poverty line, basic income would be there to supplement that income. And when we think about that form of delivering basic income, there are two groups of Canadians who already receive a form of basic income. So the Canada Child Benefit is a kind of a basic income that's delivered to families with kids under the age of 18. Seniors receive the OAS, and if they qualify, also the guaranteed income supplement. So people over 65 in this country also have a form of guaranteed income, a form of basic income. So the greatest gap in our system is for working aged adults, people between the ages of 18 and 64. And half of the people living in deep poverty in this country are between the ages of 18 and 64. Why do we need a basic income? Basic income eliminates persistent poverty. It replaces the bureaucratic, stigmatizing provincial welfare system. It makes it easier for people to receive the support that they require. And it also provides economic security for everyone, including those of us who don't now need income support. So it's a form of insurance that sits out there, available to us if we need additional help. And many people wonder what would happen if we offered a basic income of about $20,000 a year to all adult Canadians. How could we do that? Some people worry that it would lead to people working less. Basic income has been experimented with all over the world, in low-income countries, middle-income countries, high-income countries. And the one regularity that we find all the time is that people don't stop working when a basic income program is in place. Two recent experiments, one that took place in the Netherlands in the city of Utrecht, and one that took place in Finland, showed not only that people didn't stop working or didn't reduce the number of hours that they worked, but that people who were previously working at precarious jobs and previously working part-time or temporary jobs, when they received a basic income, they were more likely to transition to standard jobs, to full-time jobs, and just to begin to be able to earn reasonable incomes. Analysis that's been done on other kinds of programs that are similar to basic income, like for example, the Canada Child Benefit, also shows us that people don't stop working when you introduce this kind of a program. When the Canada Child Benefit was introduced, more mothers began to work, particularly single mothers. They were more likely to enter the workforce and to get jobs. Married mothers worked slightly fewer hours, but it wasn't statistically significant. Overall, it led to an increase in work effort. What do people spend the money on? One of the first things that people do is to invest in additional education. Canada has its own history with basic income experiments. We experimented with a basic income called MINCOME in the 1970s, and that was my first introduction to the idea of basic income. That project, that experiment, took place in the province of Manitoba, and it offered a number of families in Manitoba guaranteed income for 3 years. And one of the first things that people do is to invest in education. That led to a lot of young people, a lot of adolescents graduating from high school who wouldn't have graduated otherwise. So there was an increase in the high school completion rate. As many of you might know, there was an attempt to run a basic income experiment in Ontario a couple of years ago. It was canceled after the provincial election. But in the short period of time that that experiment ran and people were receiving checks, the first thing that many did was to register for community college. In other countries, we see similar results. The same thing happened in Finland. The same thing happened in the Netherlands. Even in low-income countries, people tend to invest in education. So in Africa, for example, in the country of Malawi, there was an attempt to offer basic income. And one of the first things that happened is that families registered adolescent girls in high school. Boys were already going to school, girls weren't. When their families received a basic income, girls were more likely to go to high school as well. People invest in better housing. And when families have better housing, kids change schools less often. Kids in difficult circumstances are less likely to get lost. They're more likely to develop supportive relationships, to do better on standardized tests, and to complete high school. The big finding and my particular interest was in mental and physical health. When I re-examined the MINCOME data from Manitoba in the 1970s, I found that people were hospitalized less often when they received a basic income. And in fact, hospitalization fell by about 8.5%. When Ontario ran its basic income guarantee experiment, people reported better physical and mental health. Physical and mental health improved in Finland and in all of the other countries where basic income was offered. We know that poverty is correlated with poor outcomes for children in particular. And one of the questions I think many people approach basic income with is, does it improve the lives of children? We know that kids living in families who are living below the poverty line have a greater involvement with Children's Aid, with Child and Family Services. There's a greater involvement with youth justice. They're less likely to do well at school and less likely to graduate from high school on time. When their families receive a basic income, those opportunities change. Families have better economic resilience, family violence decreases. One of the most interesting findings, I think, relates to criminalization. In Canada today, 80% of the women who are in prison are there for poverty-related crimes. The most common reasons for jailing women, and in particular Indigenous women, are theft, fraud, and drug trafficking, all of which are related to poverty. So the purpose of a basic income is to support people through transitions in their lives. Sometimes those transitions involve moving into or out of institutions. So children aging out of the foster care system, for example, or people who've been in prison who need to transition back into the community and rebuild their lives. People leaving violent relationships require a basic income in order to make changes in their lives and live better lives. But I think in the context of COVID in particular, one of the things we need to think about is what happens when entire populations go through economic transitions. So when there are public health crises like COVID-19, for example, and many people lose their jobs, a basic income is there to support people as the economy finds its feet again and the economy starts to recover. We had slightly more than a decade ago, there was an international financial crisis that led to large-scale unemployment. A basic income would have helped the families who were traumatized by that change. But a basic income also supports the economy as it's changing over time. So if we think about the kinds of ongoing long-run changes that are taking place in the economy, for example, the change away from carbon-intensive industries, oil and gas, and towards different kinds of industries, a lot of workers are displaced from those industries and need to retrain to get jobs in the new and growing sectors of the economy. A basic income provides the resources they need to retrain and to establish themselves in these new areas. Another thing that many people talk about is the growth of artificial intelligence and automation. If you think about the way factories were run 20, 30 years ago with vast numbers of employees, we know that employment in the manufacturing sector, for example, has declined dramatically over the last 30 years. The factories in many cases are still there and producing more than ever, but now they're being produced by machines and there are far fewer people in employment. So as the economy goes through these kinds of changes, we need to find a way to support people as the economy changes to retrain for the new kinds of jobs that are coming along. The one question that many people ask when we talk about a basic income is, can we afford it? Particularly in the context of COVID-19, we know we've spent a lot on emergency supports, and we know that the deficit, the debt are growing. Can we afford a basic income? And I think we need to think about cost of a basic income. Two years ago, the Parliamentary Budget Office is the arm's length organization that attempts to keep governments honest. And the Parliamentary Budget Office was asked what it would cost to roll out basic income for all Canadians. And they estimated those costs at about $43 billion a year, which sounds like a tremendous amount of money. But I want you to think again about those 177 programs that are offered in British Columbia to support people with low incomes and their counterparts in every province across this country. We're already spending a tremendous amount of money to address poverty in this country, but we're spending it in very inefficient ways. And in particular, the provinces are already spending half the cost of a basic income simply by delivering provincial income assistance. Welfare payments collectively cost the provinces about $20 billion a year. So just by replacing that one single program, we've got half the costs of offering a basic income. And just to put it in context, we could offer a basic income to all Canadians for about what we pay for the Canada Child Benefit, and for less than half the price we pay to offer pensions for seniors. The Parliamentary Budget Office was asked, well, what would happen this year if we introduced a basic income in the midst of COVID-19? And the thing about a basic income is that it's a program that automatically expands and contracts to meet needs. So when employment grows, as it did during COVID-19, up to a peak of about 12.5%, it meant that the costs of offering a basic income during this pandemic year would be much higher than they were 2 years ago, because it depends on the state of the economy. And that's a strength and not a weakness. The cost of a basic income automatically expands and contracts because the program itself is an automatic stabilizer. It automatically contracts and expands to meet the needs of people, to ensure that people have the resources they need during hard economic times. So even this year, when the cost of a basic income would be much, much higher than it was in previous years, it would still cost less than the emergency supports the government put in place, like the CERB. But I think it's important to think about basic income in other terms. We have to think of basic income not as a cost to the economy, but rather as an investment. And when you think about basic income as an investment in our neighbors and our families and our friends, then what we need to look at is not the cost of that, but rather the return. What do we get for that investment? And what we get is less pressure on all our other social programs. We can stop treating poverty in our emergency departments. We can stop treating poverty through our jails, through children's aid, child and family services. A basic income creates a more resilient society, a society that's capable of weathering shocks like a pandemic, like a financial crisis. So I think the question we have to ask ourselves is can we afford not to have a basic income? And I think we're really at a critical juncture right now when we talk about basic income, because we're at a point where some decisions need to be made about what the economy should look like going forward. And I think there's a parallel between basic income right now and Medicare, universal health care in the 1960s. In the 1960s, there were a number of proposals for publicly funded healthcare, and they were opposed by the powers that be. They were opposed by the bureaucrats. They were opposed by the medical establishment. And Medicare was introduced. It was introduced for all Canadians. It's now one of our most popular programs, but it was introduced because ordinary people from a huge range of background and experiences demanded change. They met together in church basements and in community centers, and they shared their stories and they shared their need. And they wrote letters to members of parliament. They wrote letters to editors. They were on the radio. They told stories. They held public meetings. And essentially, it was ordinary people who demanded changes in the policies available to Canadians. And I think in some ways, that's the position we're at with basic income right now. We know that there's a lot of conversation about how to best design social programs. We know that the social programs we have in place are inefficient. We know that they don't work very well. We know that even with the amount of money that's spent on all of the various programs that are put in place to assist people with low incomes, we still see a proliferation of tent cities. We still see people sleeping rough. We're still addressing poverty in shelters and in emergency departments and prisons. We still rely on food banks. So the programs we have don't work. They don't address poverty, and they cost a lot of money. And the question is, can't we spend some of that money in a more efficient and more effective way to address poverty? We've got a lot of data from experiments that have taken place both in Canada and abroad. Two big experiments in Canada, well, one full one that was completed a long time ago in the 1970s called MinCom, and a much more recent one that was canceled in Ontario. But there were completed experiments in other high-income countries that have given us a lot of data about what a basic income can look like. Is it a time to consider this seriously? And I think I'm going to stop talking at that point and just suggest that there are some resources available if you want to find out more about basic income. The first website on this slide is for the Basic Income Canada Network. And the second is for the Ontario Basic Income Network. The Basic Income Canada Network has a number of links to resources all over the world and to regional organizations. The Ontario Basic Income Network has a very helpful website that is available. But thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you very much, Evelyn, for an enlightening talk. And we now have an opportunity for questions to come from the audience. So as I suggested before, please put your question in the text window and I will pose it to Evelyn. So the first question is from Gosselin Peluso. And the question is there an ideal dollar amount? How is this determined? And is there an amount above which the benefits diminish?
Yeah, that's a really good question. The basic guarantee should be set at a level close to the official poverty line, which in Canada right now for an individual is about $20,000. It varies a little bit from province to province. For every dollar of earnings you have or of other income you have, the benefits reduced by a proportion. So for every dollar you earn, your benefit might be reduced by 50 cents. And so that what that means is that if you have no income, you receive $20,000. If you go out and you work and you're working part-time and you earn $10,000 a year, your benefit would be reduced by $5,000. So your total earnings would be, the total amount you have to live on would be the $10,000 you earn plus $15,000 from the basic income. And so it gradually disappears over time. And the level at which it disappears depends on the level you set it at and how you design the program. But it usually is about twice the level of the guarantee. So if you were to set the basic income at $20,000, everybody earning up to $40,000 would receive at least something from the program. And above that, it would fall to zero.
Thank you. Next question from Anne. The understanding is that none of these experiments have led to permanent programs, and some were even terminated early. Can you comment on why that was?
I think there are three fears people have about basic income. The first one is the cost. And I think the cost has been overstated because I don't think people realize how much we're currently paying for poverty and for addressing the consequences of poverty. The second is a fear that it's the fear that people won't work if you offer a basic income. We actually have a great deal of data saying that, in fact, that's not true. We know that that's not true. People continue to work. But I think the third one is a bigger issue, and that's an ideological issue. It's a matter of value judgments. And I think a lot of people aren't prepared to trust people to make their own decisions. The one thing about the programs we currently have in place is that they are very bureaucratic programs, and they limit support. And they require people to meet particular requirements. They attempt to force people to behave in particular ways. A basic income gives people the freedom to spend their money any way they want to. And I think it's very hard for us to trust other people to make decisions about their own lives. And so that does lead to the end of experiments when governments change. And that was certainly the case in Ontario. The other programs have continued. They haven't been canceled early in most cases, but they did not lead yet to permanent programs. Hopefully that'll change.
Thank you. A question in terms of the ideal dollar amount. The question is about how can we factor in regional income differences into that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. In Canada, we have, I think, in my opinion, it needs federal leadership to have a basic income in Canada. Most of the provinces are in no position to offer this on their own. And provinces clearly do have different costs of living. And we do have the capacity in this country, and we have a long tradition of allowing provinces to opt out of national programs and to offer their own version of a program with compensation from the federal government. So if you think of the Canada Pension Plan, for example, Quebec has opted out and they run their own pension plan. If you think of the carbon tax, that's another example. Provinces that have their own carbon tax that meets minimum standards don't have to participate in the national carbon tax. And we can do the same thing with the basic income, which would give provinces the capacity to tailor the program to their own needs and to regional circumstances.
Thank you. A follow-up question from Gus. Can you comment more on how the mechanism for the precariously employed people to move to more secure work?
Yeah, it sounds paradoxical, doesn't it? But in fact, it happens because people have the security to make long-term plans. And it's actually consistent with a lot of economic theory. It turns out that people who are unemployed very often move to better jobs than people who are working in low-income jobs. And that's because if you're really desperate to get work of any kind, you sometimes settle for jobs that are not very good jobs, that are precarious jobs, that are temporary, that pay low wages. If you have a basic income you can count on, you can be a little more selective about the jobs you take. Instead of taking the first offer that comes along, you can wait until a job offer comes along that actually that actually offers you the capacity to work over the long term. That a job that actually dovetails with your own particular qualifications and interests. And as I said, that's very, very consistent with theory.
Thank you. One very basic but probably difficult to answer question. What can we do to help make this happen?
I think you need to go to the websites. You need to go to the websites that I recommended, and you'll find all kinds of people across this country who are engaged in various activities in order to encourage the conversation about basic income in various ways. So there are people lobbying politicians at all levels. There are politicians involved. One of the greatest supports for basic income right now is coming out of the Senate. There's the Senate Finance Committee has recommended a basic income, is encouraging the federal government to move forward on that. So there are a number of people who are involved, a number of politicians who are involved in advocacy for a basic income, and there are a number of groups that have written letters of support, and some of them are very odd ones. We find, for example, the Steelworkers Union, which is the largest private sector union in Canada, has written a letter of support for basic income, has written to the Prime Minister requesting a basic income. 75 different women's groups have collaborated, writing a letter to Chrystia Freeland and to Prime Minister Trudeau, asking them to move on a basic income. So there are all kinds of organizations of artists and everybody you can imagine advocating for basic income.
Thank you. A question.
I should say, sorry, before I go on, that both the NDP, both the NDP and the Green Party of Canada have this as part of their official platforms.
Okay, and that answers a question that somebody asked, so that's great. Yeah, so a question from Yossi Karoff. When basic income is used for prolonged times, does it not create a marginalized social class? And should basic income be conditioned on some return to society, such as being forced to provide volunteer services?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And some people have suggested that. I think that the proliferation of social programs we have right now creates a marginalized class and keeps people dependent. I think it's very hard for people to escape from the coercive bureaucracies that are currently in place. What a basic income does is it stops requiring people to spend all of their times navigating the bureaucracies in order to get the support they need and to think a little bit long term. And so in my opinion, a basic income actually would encourage people to not be dependent in the way that current programs encourage. Some people certainly have suggested that we make these programs conditional on participating either in work or in education or in volunteer activity. But what we find when we offer people a basic income is that they do that on their own. We don't actually have to hire bureaucrats to chase people to make sure that they're actually using their time in productive ways. If you think about food banks in Canada, for example, most of the food banks in Canada rely on volunteer labor. And if you talk to the volunteer labor, you find out very quickly that most of the volunteers are also clients of the food bank. So many of the people who are actually engaged in volunteer activity are people who would benefit from a basic income. Similarly, many of the employees of social enterprises would benefit from a basic income, and this would encourage that particular sector. So I think basic income is an opportunity for people to become independent of the social system, whereas the current system encourages dependence.
Thanks for that. A similar question along the similar lines about making sure that the money is spent wisely to discourage the low income, basic income recipients from spending money on what we might consider frivolities. What do you think of the idea of providing something like food stamps or housing vouchers so that the money is forced to be directed to basic needs? When
my paycheck comes, I have the freedom to spend it any way I want. I think this is the issue I mentioned earlier. Um, I think that there's a reluctance to trust people to know their own needs. And I think if you spend a lot of time talking to people who are living on low incomes, you learn very quickly that people are pretty good judges of what it is they need. And they do spend that money in reasonable ways. I think that offering people help, offering people assistance with financial literacy, for example, is a good idea. Offering people budgeting advice is a good idea. I don't think it should be required. I believe that we can trust people to make decisions in the interests of themselves and their families. And I think they can make better decisions than caseworkers can make or that experts can make on their behalf.
Thank you. Another question. If UBI is so good, then why have more countries not adopted it? According to this question, three countries have adopted it out of 188 who have attempted it. Also, the concern is it's dependent on the economy going up, and what impact is it likely to have on the deficit?
It's not, 180 countries haven't attempted it. There have been very few countries that have experimented with basic income, but there have been experiments all over the world. Usually, and they've all been intentionally short-term experiments. In low-income countries, they tend to be funded by foundations, international foundations, and they are from the outset temporary programs. So there was never any reason to believe that they would become long-term. I think that we are moving towards a basic income, and I do believe that we will have a basic income in Canada in my lifetime. As I said at the outset, two groups of Canadians already have it. The Canada Child Benefit is a basic income. Seniors' pensions is a basic income. The only people who haven't offered it to are working age adults. And the set of programs that we currently have is a failing set of programs. So basic income is an opportunity to do better. And I think if we add up very carefully the amount of money we're spending on programs that don't work, we'll see very quickly that basic income is a better use of taxpayer money.
Thank you. One question is, again, isn't the real issue why people are poor even when the economy is good? Is the problem because of issues with drugs or alcohol or other mental issues, and therefore people are not making good decisions? Therefore, if you give them money, will they continue not to make good decisions?
Some people are poor because they make poor decisions. Some people make poor decisions because they're poor. Most people are poor because they don't have enough money. The root cause of poverty for most people is insufficient money. There's no reason to believe that people are poor because of bad decisions they make.
Thank you. I don't see any more questions. If somebody has asked a question that I have missed, okay, I see one more question, but if I'll post that one. But if somebody has asked a question other than Bryce that I have missed, can you please post it again in the chat, because it can sometimes scroll away and get away from me. This question is, where would the funding come from to support this initiative?
That's a really good question. We currently spend $122 billion every year on income assistance for well-off Canadians. These are tax expenditures. These are things like the preferential treatment of capital gains, 65% of the benefit of which goes to Canadians earning more than $250,000 a year. Almost 90% of which goes to Canadians earning more than $100,000 a year. $122 billion in preferential treatment for high-income Canadians through the income tax system. So that's a good place to start. $60 billion a year is lost through tax evasion and aggressive income tax avoidance. So I think that there are a lot of ways that we can raise the money to support a basic income. If you want to look at increasing taxes, which taxes could increase, $23 billion in net cost of offering a basic income program after we replace provincial income assistance. We could pay for that with 3 percentage points on the GST. So the amount of money that's required to offer this program is not dramatic. We can offer a better program, and I believe we can do it by eliminating some of the programs we already pay for that do a very poor job of addressing the needs of Canadians.
I have a question. They tried it in Finland, but they didn't stay with it. What was the problem, or where the problems?
They did try it. They had an experiment in Finland. They didn't try a permanent policy. There are still parties in Finland who would like to introduce a basic income as a permanent program, but there was a change in government, and the Conservative parties that are in charge are not in support of basic income.
Thank you. Okay, so I think that's all the questions we have. Again, thanks to everyone for attending. And I've posted in the chat some links if people would like to read Evelyn's book. You may have to scroll way back up to the top of the chat, but I'll also make sure that it gets posted in the meetup information as well. And thank you again to Evelyn for a very informative presentation, and a lot of challenging questions that you dealt with very well. So I appreciate that. And I'd like to now draw people's attention to some of our upcoming events. So this event that shows up in Zoom when you try to attend this the event on UBI, if you think you were attending an event on free will, that one's actually coming on February 28th. And that's a philosopher named Greg Caruso, who's going to speak about free will, punishment, and criminal justice. Some of you may be familiar with Greg Caruso. For those of you who aren't, probably a lot of you are familiar with Daniel Dennett. And Greg and Dan Dennett have had a lot of discussions about free will and what it means with respect to personal responsibility and retribution. And there are actually some, there is a book upcoming, and I believe there's also a video presentation upcoming. So I'm expecting this will be an interesting talk. There's a number of other talks coming up in March and April. Check out the virtual branch meetup. Also check out your Critical Links newsletter, where we post all the events. We also have an event coming up hosted by our Victoria branch on this coming Wednesday, I believe. It's at 7 p.m. Pacific time, and it's about decolonization. Please check out Meetup Facebook, CFIC website to get more information about upcoming events. Our past events are recorded and made available on our YouTube channel. So if you missed something or you want to watch again, you always have an opportunity to do that. Few closing remarks. As I mentioned at the beginning, CFIC is Canada's only national nonprofit for scientific inquiry and secular community. We hope that those of you who are not already members will consider purchasing a membership. We'll include a link to our membership page in the chat window, and also you can get it through Meetup. We hope that you'll consider joining. Not only does your membership provide financial support to CFIC, it also adds your voice to those who support science, critical thinking, and secularism. As we grow in numbers, so does our influence with government decision makers and the public opinion that guides them. We advocate for evidence-based decisions on government policy, healthcare, public education, and human rights. And so if you are have come to the conclusion that basic human rights, public policy should be leads to UBI, then hopefully this will have educated you in that direction. If concerns like climate change, blasphemy laws, education curriculum, medical, pseudoscience are important to you, please consider becoming a CFIC member. Without us, major influences will continue to be large self-interested groups and institutions that benefit from making baseless claims and spreading pseudoscience. We ask you to please consider membership. It's only $30 per year for an individual or $45 for a household. I'd like to thank the CFIC volunteers who help with this and other events. If you'd like to volunteer with CFIC, please sign up on our website. There are many interesting positions to choose from. Once more, I'd like to thank Evelyn for being our speaker this afternoon. And Zoom does not do well with audible clapping, but I invite everybody to express your appreciation. You use the clap icon that you can find by tapping or clicking on the reactions icon and then select more, and you should be able to see the clap icon. Again, thanks everybody for coming to this talk, and thank you again to Evelyn, and hope everybody has a good afternoon.